Mhm. All right, let's see. Wait for this to do its thing. I think we're probably up on YouTube now. Ryan Olkey, what's up, buddy?
Hey man, good to see you.
Good to see you, dude.
We are rocking the nerdery glasses today, both of us.
Well, this is something we'll get into today. We're both
Yeah.
we're both getting old. We're both we're we're both like being prescribed like bifocals, and
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
it's middle age is a bear, man.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, that is sort of on track with what we want to talk about today. We thought we would do an episode today titled "Inhabit Your Humility." And this is going to be a good one, Ryan, because, last week, Keith Witt and I did an episode of Wit and Wisdom. We're actually talking about the theme of humility. Actually, we're talking about it in the context of the H Factor, which is a book that Keith talked about during the show that
Hmm,
basically takes a look at the big five personality types,
hmm,
and it's suggesting a sixth. And it's the H Factor. It's the H
hmm,
stands for honesty and humility. And
hmm,
what's interesting here is that of all the personality factors described, when it comes to the big five, each of the personality factors described, it's not like one is negative and one is positive, or you know what I mean? They're all
hmm,
they're all sort of neutral. But
hmm,
this is the one factor that is if you score high in honesty and high in humility, that is seen as a very, very positive thing, and it's going to have a very positive
hmm,
benefits for the rest of your life. Whereas if you score super low on honesty and humility, you're probably going to run into some problems. So
hmm,
it's interesting because it's the one sort of personality factor there that, again, sort of, there is a right way and a wrong way here.
hmm,
All the other ones, extrovert, introvert, there's no judgment associated with that. But
hmm,
in terms of being, honest or dishonest, or having
hmm,
humility, or
hmm,
boastful arrogance, that's
hmm,
there's sort of, that's sort of a more of a black and white there. So that
hmm,
opened up this whole discussion about humility. And
hmm,
I've really been thinking a lot about, the concept of humility as it intersects with the integral community. um I continue to think that the integral model has been such a gift to so many people. And one of the really, really powerful things about the integral model is it gives so much explanatory power. You know what I mean? Like we get to sort of internalize this massive comprehensive map where it kind of like we feel like we always know where we are in relation to everything else. It makes the universe feel understandable. And there's a seduction there. I think there's a seduction that because the universe feels a little bit more understandable, because we have this sort of scaffolding of reality, we kind of start to let ourselves think that we know a little of everything,
hmm.
you know.
Yeah.
And I think that there is an increasing need. We're seeing an increasing need, particularly in our culture, our media culture, for what we'll call in the show epistemic humility. And that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about. I mean, we're going to talk about humility across, a number of different stages, let's say stages of life. We can talk about physical humility, particularly for us as we're entering middle age and we're kind of starting to feel the
Hmm,
entropic forces maybe a little bit more than we did 10
hmm.
years ago.
Yep.
So there's that physical humility. Then there's an intellectual humility. We'll spend a little bit talking about spiritual humility, what that means. And then
Hmm,
at the end of the show, I figured we would do something a little bit fun. I've got the top 10 integral stereotypes for us to take a look at, which will be another opportunity for us to, I think, self-reflect, practice a little humility, and see
hmm,
which of these kind of caricatures we may or may not line up with, or maybe some of them represent versions of ourselves that we were in the past and we've since recovered. But it'll be fun,
hmm.
so I hope everyone sticks around for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, Ryan, humility, what do you think of the topic, buddy?
Hmm. Well, thanks for the setup. I mean, it makes me think off the bat, like, four quadrants of just like what humility looks and feels like in each quadrant. Because we kind of already set that up, I mean, like there's like that physical humility that arises from physical experiences, but inner humility, whether that's through spirituality or psychologically or something like that, relational humility, like how are we humble? That's oftentimes how we feel it the most. a lot of times is relational, you know. I think
Mhm.
physical and then relational of like, you know, humble with respect to what, you know, and then you can see it in terms of looking at systemic things. But I also think I was thinking about this, you know, do like a show about humility, like I don't know, begs the feeling of being humble, of like, you know, like part of me is being like, let's talk about how you could be humble, you know. I was like, I'm like, well,
Hey, who the hell are you to talk to
yeah,
me about humility?
yeah, right. So part of it, so like it's a funny thing. So partly like I lean towards just like that raw experience of it, of just like I like you said, the honesty and humility, because they go together, of just like that's what for me it is, inhabit just like, let me just sit with that, you know, like of like my own rawness around my own experience of humility when it arises. And a lot of times it's like something that happens on its own, you know. It's kind of a funny thing. Let me cultivate being humble. Like I don't think like that's the direct, I don't know, it's something about it seems like it's an indirect thing, like something happens with letting go, surrendering, life happening, you know, like
Mhm.
meeting some experience that was not in our control and acknowledging it and letting go. So we can talk about intellectual humility as, you know, that horizon, like when you start talking with somebody intellectually, you can start feeling your own arrogance, you know, and eventually you're gonna be like, okay, maybe I'm gonna let go into that. So like for me, I always like, it's kind of like after the fact of the humility is like, you know, and then it's like, okay. I also do
So
want to
you're
say
saying
that,
we don't find humility, humility finds us is sort of what
yeah,
you're
that's,
saying.
you said it better. That's my that seems to be my experience. And I know too, you have a nice graph that you'll talk about later, but like all of us typologically, I think, are end up in different spots where like I know some friends who are really confident, assertive in ways that like I had to like grow into,
Mhm.
and but they would lean towards maybe being arrogant, you know, and where I would have been like labeled, you know, externally could have been labeled as humble or something, but it was not that, you know, like for sure, like being shy and not feeling, underestimating, you know, my own abilities. So like just to know that spectrum of like the medicine we need can be different, you know, around humility and honesty, and it can take different forms. I know we're going to get into that, but that's just like the bigger frame of like typologically, you know. But I for me, you know, you already shared about, you know, middle age experiences, and like the hilarious thing of like me going to the eye doctor recently, and the normal prescription didn't really change that much, but I did mention, I was like, you know, doc, like I noticed that like I mean I'm having like reading is like I'm farsighted already. And I'm like, I'm having to hold things out, you know, I need a lot of light. And of course, I'm just like reading off textbook description of somebody who needs bifocals or progressive lenses too.
Yep.
And he was just like, oh, he slapped those extra bonus lenses in front of the machine. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can see my phone so much better. And he used the word bifocals. He didn't even use start with progressive lenses, which is what the term is used these days. Is progressive lenses for something more fancy. I was like, bifocal, get the fuck out of here. Who are you
I'm
talking
not
to?
Ben Franklin. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm not 70 years old. But then I was like, well, he's got a point.
Yeah.
And you know what's funny? There's a side note here for anybody who wears glasses. Those lenses I have, not in these, but my normal glasses are actually just invisible bifocals. They're not progressives where they progressively get more and more magnified towards the bottom. And millennials, they're a lot of them are calling them millennial progressives because a lot more millennials and younger folks, actually, not just in 40s, but like younger and younger, wear them now. It's really
Hmm.
funny, but there's a stigma about that because when we were kids, the only people who wore bifocals were really old folks because you could see them, you know, and it was
Yeah.
like a sign. Anyway, so that kind of experience, and then other health things, you know, dealing with like my breathing. I'm using an inhaler now before I exercise for exercise-induced asthma, which apparently happens to a lot of folks, actually, athletes, and really common. But you know, it's these things of being like, I
This is why I
realized
don't. This is why I don't exercise, Ryan.
it's the best way to avoid it. They actually are not calling it that anymore because it makes people feel like they want to not exercise. But yeah, anyways, these little experiences add up, and I just realized that, you know, being in the 40s, you can actually have a really physically healthy life, as healthy as like someone younger, but the amount of maintenance you have to have
Yes.
starts increasing, and that is a humbling experience.
Yeah. Yep. I think this is the decade where a lot of us start sort of hitting the wall. You know what I mean? We start hitting the wall, and we sort of encounter our own inertia.
Yeah.
And we start to feel into like how far that inertia is gonna be able to take us without additional cycles being added in, because again, with each decade it gets progressively harder to put new cycles into it. It gets harder to hit that 20th push up and that last mile, and that you really gotta push yourself. And it's interesting, Ryan, as we're talking about this, because again, I sort of started by breaking this up into
Yeah.
three stages, which can also be quadrants. I mean, we can also think about it in
Yep.
quadrants, but I think when it comes to our physical humility, I think you are spot on that, when you're 20 years old, barring chronic illness or something like that, it is very, very difficult to cultivate anything resembling, physical, biological humility, because you are, for all intents and purposes, immortal. You feel like you're going to be here forever.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of things challenging you on that physical level to actually bring about that humility. So that's a case where humility will find you. It's going to take a couple decades, but it will
and what I'd say,
doubtlessly find you.
even though it's physical, to me it's often one of the best starting points for that experience of humility in other areas. This is you see this all the time with folks who are older, or anybody who's dealing with a really difficult illness. Their perspectives change. This is classic. Sure. It's just it doesn't, it's profound. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter where somebody's developmental level is. It often happens. Humility happens, and also like a wisdom kind of comes over people a lot of times in those situations where it's really beautiful and hard to even process at a younger age, because it's just hard to relate to. Like you said, it's like, I don't have any sense of that. I'm going to live forever. But I always like it for anything like spiritual. Oh, you think you're so enlightened. I remember someone once like challenged somebody else about their Zen teacher or something, and they said, well, he shits just like I do. And which is a funny thing, because that's there's just something about that, like on the Maslow hierarchy, like we are still this physically bound being, that we stub our toes, we have headaches, we have all this stuff. No matter how enlightened we feel, we don't escape that. And that's why in like Buddhism, it's like sickness, old age, and death. It's like starting point, because it's like, why is that important to remember? Because then it says, well, the time I have is precious, and what am I going to do with that? And so for me, it's one of the best gateways, or it's the most common gateway. So that's why I bring it up,
Well, and particularly for men, I mean, this is oftentimes a gateway to something like a midlife crisis, and I think that's often the result of hitting that wall. I mean, you are suddenly confronted with mortality. I mean, you start realizing like, holy shit, I'm going to die someday, and you really, really start to feel into that, and what the sort of the consequences are for the rest of your life, your relationships, your legacy, everything that your life has been building to, is all of a sudden, sort of, here it is. It's right in front of me. You know what I mean? I've got a limited number of days. It's entirely possible I've got more days behind me than I have in front of me.
100%.
And that is going to create, again, this sort of crisis moment where, that's either going to lead you to a total breakdown or a breakthrough. I think more often than not, both. I mean, you kind of oscillate between the two until
something has to break down for something to get free.
That's right. Until some of these new wisdoms can actually find traction and take root, and and sort of begin to proliferate through the rest of your system. But until then, it's a brutal process, because you just kind of start watching yourself fall apart. And
it's always a question of like, what are you going to do in those moments? Like you said, so like it's very common. See like the guy having a midlife crisis and then goes in one direction, right? And don't help himself. So I think like it's a rich opportunity, like if find ourselves in that moment, at least for me, it's like, oh, okay. Then it clears something out, like something breaks down, like you're saying, like let go of something, shake it up, and then like, okay, now I can drop into what's more important, what's really important. Whereas before it was harder to touch into that because there wasn't something nudging me, some illusion that I was maintaining that my days aren't numbered. Well, no, even as much as we practice meditating. I've been meditating 2 decades plus, and on all those Buddhist teachings, everything like that. But it's a different thing when you taste it more and more and more and more directly, whether because of a unpredictable event in your life or just the inevitability of old age, it's different.
That's right. Well, and that's sort of the interesting thing, Ryan, is that, when it comes to something like intellectual humility, I can actually see sort of this, just as we're talking, I can kind of see this process where, as we begin to be confronted by our physical challenges and our physical mortality and all of that, our limitations, sometimes we overcompensate for that. We sort of, you know what I mean?
Right.
We sort of take the arrogance that we had placed in our body for a certain period of time, and we sort of move it over somewhere into our intellectual confidence. And that can be oftentimes just as blinding. And that's, we'll talk, a little bit today about what intellectual humility actually looks like. But it's interesting to me that we can have this sort of ground up process where our physical sort of deterioration, the inevitability of our mortality, all of that kind of can trickle up into a more sort of intellectual or epistemic humility. But the same is also true with the spiritual humility. I mean, if we cultivate that, that can also kind of trickle down, and that can sort of keep us regulated. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's important to think about these in terms of, these big sort of life stages that we go through, both, sequentially, I mean, chronologically, we go from body to mind to, to spirit throughout our lives. But, also the simultaneity of that, like here we are in our middle age, we can practice body, we can practice our intellects, we can practice our spiritual humility, all sort of at the same time simultaneously. And I think there's a value to that.
It brings up everything you just said about the views that we hold. So in Buddhism, we talk about the view, of it's like, how do we see reality? Like from at least a conceptual point, even if it's not our experience, how do we view practice? And that greatly influences. So in spiritual humility, the views we start with can be really limiting or freeing, around humility. So we see plenty of versions of spirituality where the starting view is one that's not going to lend itself well to being humble. But of course, again, and obviously I'm been referencing Buddhism a lot, but simply because of its flavor, the Four Noble Truths just start right off the bat. It's like, listen, life is full of suffering. You're going to get old, maybe, hopefully, and you're gonna be sick and you're gonna die. It's like, that view is like, well, geez, thanks for the pep talk, So that's that. But we see lots of different versions of spirituality now where it's just like, you could become a god essentially, and it's like, well, okay, well then that's gonna be tough. That's gonna hurt more later, at some point. So this just brings up the fact to me is like, pay attention to our views, like in whatever we're bringing into whatever practice, in the broad scope of integral practice, what's our views? Because those are embedded, and really hard to shake free of them. It shapes how we practice. So
that's right. That's right. Well, another thing, and maybe this will segue us into talking about some of the intellectual humility stuff.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you were talking about was sort of the relationship between confidence and humility. And it kind of feels like they're opposites, right? But I want to suggest that they're not really opposites. We can actually tease these qualities apart. We can actually deliberately practice the cultivation of a confident humility.
Yeah.
And that's what I want us to talk about today, because there's a difference between sort of the intrapersonal confidence, which is, my sense of my self-esteem, my sense of my own strengths and my awareness of my weaknesses, my capacity to rise to the occasion, my commitment to, learning and growing and awakening and all of that. I mean, all of that gives me sort of this inner resolve, this inner confidence. And I can hold that at the same time that I hold an epistemic humility, where I can remind myself of how little I actually know. I mean, when we consider all the things that there are to be known, I occupy a very small bubble. You occupy another bubble. Fortunately, my bubble and your bubble can intersect, and that can expand, sort of the territory of our knowledge. But I think the point here is that there comes a point in our lives where we need to begin to recognize that we are just a single cosmic address within an intricate, infinitely
Yeah.
vast
Yeah.
cosmic neighborhood.
Yeah.
And as a result, we can only enact, reality one slice at a time.
That's
And that slice
so,
is
so
always going to
important.
be limited.
That's so important. I think, thinking about, like, we've talked about how like green is like pre-integral kind of
Mhm.
thing, like this connection. There's something about that, what you just said there, that I think is really important for integral folks, is like that something about that evolving is like that recognition to me of like how, like, even though there's this grand map and that we can pay attention and be aware of all these different interweaving simultaneity things rising, like we are only one person and therefore we need each other, actually.
Right.
Therefore, and there's no separating, each other, but like to just acknowledge that and say like, okay, I can only do so much. So what am I going to do? What's most important? If we talk about what's mine to do kind of thing. But that's really important, because I think in the integral community, because otherwise it's just like, man,
Yeah.
big ego, and like I'm going to hold the whole entire map and try to pay attention to everything, and then it's just exhausting on an actual personal level to try to do that. But it is kind of humbling to be like, well, I cannot actually do 20 different practices at
Right.
at a time to become superhuman.
Right. I could do that when I was 25 and not when I'm 45.
Yeah, I could pretend to do it.
Yeah,
I could write out the list and believe myself.
Yeah.
that I was going to do that. I literally have that list over here. I kept it. It's on my shelf so I can look at it sometimes and laugh at myself. It's hilarious. It's seriously like 2 pages. I wrote down 2 pages of practices that Stuart Davis later graded as an F. You read on my journal.
Well, that's what you get for letting Stuart Davis read your journal.
I know, but I love it. Now it's, and so a little bit more though, what you just said about like confidence and humility going together. I saw an interesting little tweet thread from our friend Vince Ficori Horn, and somebody had tweeted, growing increasingly wary of people who exhibit certainty. So it's like thing about like, be willing to question yourself, and there's humility there. And then Vince provided a counterpoint, growing increasingly wary of people who can question their certainty but then won't take a moral stand when it matters. So there's like a confidence. So it's like this integration. It wasn't like an either or thing.
That's right.
It's just like, yeah, how can we show up confidently because things matter, and how do we remain humble and open and recognize all of what we don't know? And that's like a practice, it's a practice of like doing that. And we're not always going to be right. You know what I mean? Like, even if we try to do that, we're like, oh, this time I'm going to question more. No, I needed to confidently take a step forward. Oh no, I should have taken a step back. We just do our best. But yeah, usually that's the dilemma, is like going back and forth between these two things, like question everything or be super confident, like, one or the other.
Yep. Guess what, guys? You can have both. You can have that cake and eat it too.
Yeah. It feels more fluid, like that way, to be able to respond like that and hold both. Oh, and then there was a follow-up tweet. I forget. I don't know what the quote was from, but it was like, not knowing doesn't mean you don't know. And I don't remember who said it. Maybe it was Suzuki Roshi or somebody, but somebody tweeted that. Again, it's playing with something else, of like taking something that we have like as a normal, simple kind of dichotomy and, unraveling and saying, well, it's not so simple. The lived experience is not so simple.
Right. Well, and we can sort of zoom that all the way out and again talk about that sort of on the level of spiritual humility, because I think that anyone who has been engaged in a spiritual practice for any meaningful amount of time has come to at least a trickle of insight that tells them that all of this is play, all of this is illusion to begin with. So even the things that we take as being as solid can be, anytime we feel like there is just solid ground beneath our feet, well, guess what, guys? That's actually part of the illusion. That's kind of part of the trap. Right. And I think that sort of spiritual wisdom brings with it a humility that sort of acts as a constant reminder that all of this is as substantial as like tissue paper. You know what I mean? That all of this is fleeting, and literally everything that you have ever loved can disappear in a moment. in a moment without any provocation. And there's something beautiful and perfect about that. And sort of, I think the spiritual dilemma is finding peace with that. Right.
Yeah.
And that requires an enormous amount of humility.
Yeah. And so that's, yeah, you're right. I mean, like a lot of times in classical kind of awakening paths, you know, that's where it's starting. And like something like Buddhism, like start right there to just dislodge that attachment, you know, and to wake ourselves up, like, whew, listen, it's fleeting, it's groundless. But, you know, we can take it, often you have to take it even further, because sometimes people can have that realization, you know, and then what becomes certain is something like emptiness, you know, like emptiness is certain, like non-duality, whatever it might be. There's like, that's certain. And then you go to the doctor and they're like, you gotta have bifocals or your cholesterol is way too damn high, you know, things like you know. So like it's like it's ongoing practice. Like the desire to find an endpoint is continual and really subtle. Like that's why it's more like layers. Even if you can have a breakthrough experience and a deep, you know, letting go of into selflessness and emptiness, non-duality, you know, still you can find ways in which certainty is there, you know, in the background that we attach ourselves to. In anyways, yeah.
Well, I've got some pretty pictures to share.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is coming, and a lot of this is coming from a book that I just started reading. Well, let me give you a little background here. So about a week or two ago, I happened upon an article on Substack, which, you know, has some interesting stuff sometimes. Some really great writers go over to Substack oftentimes. And this was an article that was compiling some information from a handful of books that I found really, really interesting and really germane to a lot of the things that I was just sort of thinking about in integral land anyway. And so this really lit me up, and I looked for the author of the article. Unfortunately, with Substack, there's a lot of sort of anonymous stuff out there. So, you know, the guy who wrote the article was just some dude named John. I don't even have a last name. And I was like, okay, well, I can't really cite this stuff. So let me, you know, try to find the sources and dig into there. So I picked up this book, which is called Think Again by Adam Grant, which I've only just begun reading, but it is, man, it speaks to me. And I think it speaks to some of the natural qualities of a healthy integral mind that I'm not sure have been fully and properly explicated for people. So, you know, we oftentimes think about or talk about integral thinking, vision, logic, you know, things like that, without really getting into, well, what are the qualities of that? What are sort of, you know, like we can talk about critical thinking, for example. I can tell you what critical thinking is. You can even teach critical thinking as sort of a methodology. What is integral thinking? You know what I mean? What is our version of that, where we can actually give you sort of, you know, here's a paradigm, a set of practices. And if you do these practices, you're going to feel the quality of your own thought processes improving. That's I think there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of you know, wrapping some sense around that. This book, I think, is one of the sources that is, again, sort of implicitly doing that. And it's called Think Again. And it's about, again, it's about exactly the conversation we're having right now. It's about recognizing where in our lives we are leading with too much certainty, and to invite ourselves to constantly engage in a process of rethinking our core assumptions, rethinking our views, rethinking how we apply our values in the world. Because oftentimes we get caught in this, well, I mean, we're talking about Buddhism. I think of the story of the Buddha, who was a prince in a palace. And, you know, when he lived in this palace, all of the suffering, all of the worst elements that create humility in our lives were kept away from him. Right. Until one day he saw sick people and dying people. And, well, I kind of think, you know, in a lot of ways, our culture is sort of set up like that. Like our culture is set up in so many ways to preserve as much comfort as possible and create as much distance from this sort of mundane suffering. You know what I mean? Like we go to the grocery store, we don't have to kill an animal for meat. We go to a grocery store where it's nicely packaged in plastic, and we take it home and we eat it, and we don't think about, you know, the actual death of the animal that is feeding us today. Things like that. I feel like in a lot of ways, we are all sort of living in Buddha's palace before, you know, before the crash, before the dark night. And, you know, I think that's also true in terms of sort of the little kingdoms that we create in our own minds, right? we tend to have sort of overly solid sets of conclusions and ideas and processes, and it can be hard to penetrate that. Sometimes it can be hard to sort of take a step back and again question some of the presuppositions and assumptions and so forth that went into constructing your view in the first place. So this book does a really, really good job, I think, of sort of pulling the rug underneath that and bringing us into a more humble relationship with our own intellect, which means a more humble relationship with how we actually end up engaging with each other and enacting each other, right? It actually leads to sort of a quieter wisdom in a certain kind of way that can be a little bit tricky to put words on, but that's just sort of the feeling I have. So maybe one of the things that we want to start with is this is a term that I think a lot of us are familiar with by now. Some people aren't, so we'll describe it, but it's called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And for those who aren't familiar, here's the Wikipedia definition of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. It's related to the cognitive bias of illusory superiority and comes from the inability of people to recognize their lack of ability. In other words, people don't know how dumb they are. And that's especially true of smart people, which we'll get to in just a second. David Dunning, one of the researchers in, the Dunning-Kruger effect, one of his quotes that people love repeating is, the first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Club is you don't know you're a member of the Dunning-Kruger Club.
Yeah,
I think it's a great one. I don't have a quote from Justin Kruger. I think he's kind of like Teller, the dude from Penn and Teller, who's always quiet. Funny. That's my impression of him. So I've got a graphic here I want to share that sort of illustrates what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. Let me find it here. There we go. Here's sort of a satirical version of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Let's see, is that showing up?
Yeah.
For me, I'm looking at the wrong screen. Okay, there it is. Shows up. So the idea being that, you got confidence on one axis and you've got your knowledge and your skills on the other. And we all sort of start out on this big hump. And in this graph, that's called Mount Stupid. And that's basically, Mount Stupid is the equivalent of, I think most of us have known the person like this, like the person who takes a psychology 101 course in their freshman year of college and then comes out thinking they know absolutely everything about the human mind possible. You have this like dramatic increase of confidence that comes with sort of scratching the surface in a topic area, right? And then for most people on most issues, that's where we stay. We stay right there at the peak of Mount Stupid. And we think we think this is it, man. This, I've done my internet research. You know what I mean? Like this is all I need to know. And there is a lot of resistance, natural resistance to moving into that second piece where it's sort of like a dark night of the mind in a certain kind of way. Here it's called the Valley of Despair. And that's where wisdom starts to come in, because one of the perennial definitions of wisdom, again, is knowing exactly how much you don't know, realizing how much of reality exists beyond your biases and your filters and, sort of all of the accumulation of experiences that causes you to enact reality in a particular way. And then once we sort of hit that rock bottom, right? And it's it feels like a dark night. It's like, oh, I just don't know anything anymore. That's when we begin sort of that long, slow climb up what it calls the slope of enlightenment towards the plateau of sustainability. I love these sort of fantasy terms that they use for these different pieces of the terrain. But I love this graphic because I do think that in so many ways, the majority of us on the majority of issues are still sitting on Mount Stupid. Now, there's probably a few areas in our lives where we are, at least in the valley or we're climbing the slope, right? But I think that when it comes to most of the ways that we enact this world, we sort of have an unearned overconfidence that I think is oftentimes reinforced by whatever social media bubbles we find ourselves in. And really, I think one of the tricks here, it's interesting because whenever people talk about Dunning-Kruger, they immediately think of other people who have it. Immediately it's like, oh yeah, no, that's the anti-vaxxers. Or if you're a vaxxer, you'd be like, oh no, that's the people who just believe everything Anthony Fauci says, hook, line, and sinker. So everyone thinks that everyone else is on the other side of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And very rarely do we see people, sort of taking it as an invitation to self-reflect, and to sort of see where they are on that in any particular issue. Another thing that I think happens is, again, because we want to other these things, because oftentimes we lack the humility to sort of self-report and self-assess and see where we are on that. I think other times too, we assume that Dunning-Kruger is something that only applies to people who are, like, let's just say, in a lower altitude than we are, or maybe less awakened or less developed, what have you, dumber in a way. I think actually there's a lot of evidence that the opposite is true, that actually the more accomplished you get in a particular specialization, let's say, there's an enormous amount of confidence that comes with that increasing competency. The problem is that confidence then gets sort of misapplied to other areas. It's like there's a halo effect, where because we're so good at doing this one thing, and we feel so confident that we're so good at doing this one thing, that we sort of assume that that same intelligence and confidence can be applied to other aspects of our lives, where we really don't have enough information to be nearly as confident as we feel ourselves. So, this is an effect that doesn't just happen to those people over there who believe that thing or who are at that altitude or whatever. The Dunning-Kruger effect, I think 95% of people at integral stages are experiencing the Dunning-Kruger effect, again, in some aspect of their lives. And I'm hoping that this show is, again, just an invitation for us to pause, take a step back, and reflect on sort of, where is it that I'm placing my certainty? Where do I have a healthy sense of uncertainty? And Ryan, this is, we talked about certainty and uncertainty in a previous episode.
Yeah.
And, I invite people to check that out too. But I think that's the opportunity of even learning, a concept like Dunning-Kruger, is it gives you that space, right? You get this little gap where you get to self-reflect, self-report, self-assess, and say, you know what? Yeah, I sort of suffer from this in all sorts of ways. And, maybe one of the things I need to do is increase my find better tools, find better ways to understand whatever it is I'm trying to understand, and maybe ease off on some of the epistemic arrogance that I've been carrying around with myself.
Yeah. This is one comment on YouTube. Somebody was wanting to know if we would talk about shadow work around humility. And actually this relates to the Dunning-Kruger
yes,
conversation.
I think all of this is shadow work in an important way. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is something true there in a foundational sense, especially like from a rational, orienting from rationality, there's going to be like just a linear logical kind of progression that makes a lot of sense with general learning, and so that's really important to pay attention to, that like, hey, this is kind of a natural cycle that can repeat, and I would argue that is going to be different every time. It's not just something that is like always the same, we talk about the phases of insight at Buddhist geeks for like a cycle that we can go through over and over, where it's like seeking and effort and breakthrough and disillusionment, equanimity, and completion. But the second time you go through that, it's definitely not the same as the first time. Like there's wisdom that happens the second time. So, but yeah, seen as a cycle. But yeah, a lot of times when I think about this, beyond knowing that and saying and realizing at least once that like, oh yeah, I can see how that cycle played out with respect to this area of knowledge, like I didn't know anything, and of course, or I thought I really knew a lot and found out I didn't. Okay. Yeah. But then it's like a lot of shadow work, and I just made me think of like one technique from the realization process where, everything is starting with inhabiting the body and then also attuning to qualities in the body that are like foundational to our being. And one of them is like knowing, and we often attune to the quality of intellect or knowing in our head. Doesn't mean that that's the only place in our body that we experience that quality, but a foundational quality. It's not about knowing any particular thing. It's knowing itself, a raw quality of knowing. And, I can have in my head and I can attune to my own quality of knowing. Now, if I do that and I feel like it's really hard, or like the internal space of my head feels small, or that it's closed off at the front or something, then that's an indication that, hey, there may be a pattern of shutting down my raw ability of knowing that then leads to me being not confident in myself or compensating to try to reclaim that lost sense of knowing. In which case, what the work there is to like practice inhabiting, see what's going on there, and then work with the content of that experience. Like, was there a time in my childhood where that first happened, where I shut down my knowing because a parent was, chastised me and said, like, you don't know anything, or something like that, right? And so shadow work is incredibly important in that sense. And that's what I would say around this knowing, intellectual humility is like, yeah, where do we experience our own knowing, raw quality of knowing, and then potentially power to, there's all kinds of things, just feeling into the whole spectrum of our being and seeing where we feel constricted and limited, such that we then overcompensate habitually in our knowing. Right. So that's just one technique. And obviously there's a bunch of therapeutic techniques that we can use to then work with the content of our experience. But as far as like a raw practice that really is something that I think a lot of people are familiar with in integral community, of like basic meditation, that is a wonderful entry point in my experience, to like kind of just feel out like, oh yeah, when I'm talking intellectually, I'm not actually present in my whole body. I'm kind of limited here and here. And this is the typical way that I engage with people. Okay.
Yep.
So
yeah, no, that's beautifully said, Ryan. I think you absolutely nailed it. And, particularly, when we're talking about things like epistemic humility, and we're talking about, trying to do a better job of tracking our own blind spots and confirmation biases, and noticing the ways that we seek out information that resonates with or confirms some pre-existing belief that we already have. I mean, just the simple act of trying to notice that and bring more awareness to it. Guess what, buddy? You're doing shadow work right now.
Yeah.
I think so much of this conversation, particularly around epistemic humility, this is sort of a 1-2 punch of growing up and cleaning up. You know what I mean?
I was just thinking the same thing as you were saying, that the growing up part there, which is really something that a good thing for anybody who's like actually coming from an integral level, is that's where a really deep appreciation of developmental humility can come on track, because it can be recognized, or whatever developmental model you want to use. There's a point in which we can recognize development itself as like this very real thing that happens. And then just because the recognition is there, so this is two-step humility. One is just like, there's a letting go. They're saying like, yeah, it's not just that we're all operating on the same level and just those idiots over there won't get on my level thing. It's like, then there's a level of like, okay, how do I engage? Even though I know that, what's the most skillful way to engage people who are coming from different developmental levels, such that I can love that level, love that person, and try to help them clean up, help them grow up. And I'd say I don't know that many people who I think are like top notch at that thing. Like, I think we're all figuring that out. Someone like Diane Hamilton comes to mind, where I'm like, she's one person. If somebody knows how to do that really, really well, I think she probably does. And there's going to be other people out there, but like, that's a different level of enacting on integral levels. But totally. That makes me humble in a certain way of being like, okay, I see that, but I'm like, man, I don't know. What's the most effective way to actually engage somebody from a different developmental level, especially around stuff like politics? It's different when you're talking about like kids and trying to help them learn. We usually feel comfortable, right? Like helping our kids learn. We know they're not operating on the levels, and we're cool with that. We love them and say like, oh, how can I help you? Comes to adults, we're like, screw you.
That's sort of an ongoing perennial question, is like, how do I talk to grandma about this stuff, right? Or how do I maintain a relationship with my crazy uncle who kind of fell down this rabbit hole? And I love the guy, but Jesus, he's nuts, and I don't know how to communicate with him anymore.
Yeah.
Or, it doesn't have to be extreme like that. Like for me, an ongoing issue I had was like, man, my spiritual life means so much to me. And I can recognize how much of that I inherited from my grandmother, who's like a hardcore amber Protestant fundamentalist. And yet I can appreciate how much of my own spiritual trajectory I've inherited for her. Man, I just want to like be able to communicate with her in a way that she knows I have a relationship with God, and I don't need to frame it in a way that,
Yeah.
freaks her out, which
Yeah.
it would if I just like talked about integrally with her.
Yeah.
So, for me, one of the shorthands that I've come up with is ignore the views, but include the values. Speak to the underlying values that are beneath these views and animating
Yeah.
these views. Like,
Well,
there's so many people who have views that I'm just like, that is a really fucking stupid view when I'm in one of my more arrogant, places.
yeah,
That's
totally.
just a stupid fucking view. How, it kind of
Yeah.
drives you crazy. But if you can take that second beat and say, okay, what are the values that are either, that are probably unaddressed right now, that is animating this view in the first place? Like, where is this view actually emerging from? Well, chances are we have a lot more to agree about on the level of values than we do on the level of view. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that requires humility. I mean, if we're saying things like, oh, that, you're so green, or, oh, you're so amber, so I can write off anything that you say from this point out because I've put you into this color-coded, box on a piece of paper somewhere, and now I can just kind of shove you aside. Well, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong, because there are wisdoms that emerge, and wisdoms, by the way, that are lost as we progress from one stage to the other, that are still being retained and maintained by other people that we need. We need this stuff. We need the earlier wisdoms. We need the full spectrum anatomy of human civilization, right?
Yeah, we've talked about that in other episodes too. I think, like, in terms of like you said, find the values or relate to that, appreciate them. We have to appreciate that and recognize those values exist within ourselves. Like, if we truly have developed and evolved, those are part of us. So like an Amber, there's values in it. Socialized mind, just call it socialized mind. It's like, I don't care if you're an integral community, you're part of a socialized mind around integral, and that's cool because we're wired that way. So we're going to be part of groups, even if we think or actually have the experience of like being able to include other developmental levels. When we're hanging out, we are hanging out in an integral community, and we just have to own that. So if we can own that in ourselves and say like, yeah, I have all these levels, egocentrism in a good and healthy way, and negative ways. Like, we can have all of those within ourselves. Ego. Yeah. And we can appreciate that in other people, And I think too, also, like, this is just examples of like how we're going to taste that humility, and then maybe let ourselves soak in it a little bit, like let it permeate our experience. Like, don't just rush past it. Like, say like, what does this feel like to let go and go, I don't, like, it matters, but I don't know what to do here. And I feel a little dumb, but also I'm going to show up. Like, what does that feel like? But then, we talk about inhabiting other people's perspectives. I think politics are a good one because it brings up like very pointed, experiences of arrogance or, lack of humility or underconfidence. Is that like, thinking about, like, for example, in the United States, what a Amber oriented community at large is experiencing, man, they're probably experiencing a lot of scary thoughts within of like their way of their worldview and their things crumbling and being taken away and getting feistier. And like, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to respond to it and do something about that. But I can imagine, like, man, it must be scary within. Like, if we cut down through all the surface level stuff, there's somebody scared underneath all of that. And what is it like to be scared in a very basic way? Oh, it's not very fun to be scared. At a very fundamental level. Okay, if I can identify with that and feel that, okay, now how am I going to engage? It doesn't mean I'm still not going to be like, sorry, the way you're acting out there because you're scared isn't acceptable. Like, we're not going to do that. So it's a balance there. And also, I would say, like, when we think about this in terms of humility, a lot of times the integral level, I feel like in the integral community, there's a lot of like just grandiose ideas, like too complicated. So it's like somebody going in real life, like into the kitchen and be like, can you make me a PB&J? Like, just let's make each other PB&Js and say and feel like we actually made a PB&J. Okay, now we'll go up. But you're like trying to do Michelin 3-star, amazing, crazy dining experience. It's like, but in acting, it was like, we don't have the fundamentals down, which requires some humility, about doing these things. And one other last thing I want to say about the family example, feeling into the multifaceted dimension of humility here and shadow work. For some folks, it may be like the humility of letting go of the relationship or of the nature of the relationship So I'm just saying it could be a lot of different things for people. Like one, maybe like, oh, I'm going to allow myself to get closer to this person and relate to them where they're at. And other people may be like, I'm going to let go of feeling like I have to. And it's really hard to let that go and just say, like, it is what it is, like,
Mhm.
so everybody's family dynamics and stuff can be really, really different. But in all of it, usually there's some humility of like, what should I do? What am I doing here? What do I want to do? What would be the best for myself, for them, for us? It's not always really obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, beautifully said. No, I totally agree. Well, I've got a couple other graphics
Yeah.
here because, the other question, I want to return to the point that we were making that,
Yeah.
confidence and humility are not opposites.
Yeah.
It's actually more like a polarity.
Yeah.
So I actually have a couple of graphs or graphics I want to share that I think sort of demonstrates that. So this first one, again, it comes from this book that I mentioned earlier, and it is talking about the confidence sweet spot. Hey, look, quadrants.
Hey, we like quadrants here.
Yeah, except with this graphic, we don't want all four quadrants. We only want one of these quadrants. So on the left side, on the y-axis, you've got secure versus insecure. So confident or not.
Yeah.
And then on the top axis, you've got certain or uncertain. Now, the idea here is that the goal, right, what we should be aspiring to is moving into that lower right quadrant where we have an interior confidence, we have an interior sense of security, but we have a healthy epistemic uncertainty. And that brings us into a sort of confident humility, which again feels like a contradiction, but it's not. That's the beautiful thing about this, is it's really, really not. Because you have the confidence to constantly rethink, to update your map as you need to. I mean, Jesus, that sounds pretty damn integral, right? And to be able to change your mind as new facts, new perspectives, new ways of looking at the world are brought into your awareness. Now, if we don't have that interior security, that interior confidence that, like, I'm capable of putting this together, even if I'm getting some shit wrong sometimes, it's Mark Fischler likes to say, it's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And that, to me, I think is a really wonderful experience of that interior confidence coupled with an epistemic humility. Now, one thing I don't like about this graphic, this way of presenting it, is it makes it seem like, again, that lower right quadrant, like that's the destination we want to sort of rush ourselves into however possible. But I think there's another way to think about it, which is represented here. What I did is I took these same ideas and turned it into a polarity map. Let's see. Is that showing up?
Yep.
Here we go. The idea here being, again, inner confidence and intellectual humility are not opposites. They are a polarity to be managed and to be integrated. And just to go through the steps here, we can start with, let's look at the top left first. So that's that's a positive inner confidence. You've got a healthy self-regard, a growth-based mindset. You have an inner confidence in your strengths and an awareness of your limitations. You have a capacity for honesty and accurate self-reporting. So basically a well-developed intrapersonal line of development. We have confidence in our inner capacity to understand and to perform. Now, what happens when that confidence gets sort of decoupled from the humility is we start sinking into the lower left. We start moving into an epistemic over certainty. This is where the Dunning-Kruger effect really starts to come online. We start to develop a sort of a blind arrogance and a resistance to change. Attacks on our knowledge are often perceived as personal attacks, right? We so identify with sort of the artifices of our intellectual understandings that, to question our intellectual understanding is to question ourselves as a human being. I see a lot of people getting caught in that trap. And then there's a need to be sort of the smartest person in the room, right? But then we overcorrect for that, which brings us up into the upper right side of the polarity map, which is a healthy epistemic uncertainty. We have the wisdom to remember how little we actually know. We have a curiosity to engage with other perspectives. We are open to changing our minds, changing our strategies, changing our maps as we need to and as new information comes in. We are holding knowledge and beliefs and our identities and constructs and our thoughts as lightly as we possibly can. This is something I often say about integral This stuff is so incredibly important to me. And that's why I feel like I need to hold it so lightly. You know what I mean? I need to bring humor to it. I need to, if I take it as seriously as the sort of arrogant part of me wants to, I know that that's only going to get in the way, right? That's going to be an obstacle. So the more important something is, the more you have to hold it lightly. And then also it seeks people who are practicing this sort of healthy epistemic uncertainty. They seek people who are more intelligent, more awakened, or more developed than ourselves. And hey, that's been my whole career track for the last 20 years right there. That's how I keep myself honest, is I try to throw myself out of my own depth, and I'm forever out of my own depth. This seat I'm sitting in right now, I feel like the ceiling is way above me. You know what I mean? I'm so completely out of my depth just talking to you and talking to Mark and talking to Ken and, talking to these brilliant people who are constantly expanding and helping me unfold my own map. Now, when that humility starts to get disconnected from our confidence, that brings us into the lower right section of the polarity map. We start to develop a debilitating doubt. We start operating from a sense of lack or a sense of insecurity or a sense of incompetence. This is where things like anxiety and fear and imposter syndromes, this has been one of my big challenges over the years. Imposter syndromes, this is where this starts to creep in. We find ourselves constantly questioning our own abilities. And in fact, our sense of self-worth is often dependent upon how other people validate us or not, right?
Yeah.
It's a terribly insecure place to be. And that's where you have a little bit too much of that humility and not enough of the confidence. So the goal here is to integrate our confidence and our humility so that we can stay on the top side of this polarity map as much as we possibly can. What I like about framing it as a polarity like this is that it's a reminder that this kind of confident humility is not an end state. It's not a destination we eventually make it to and then we, make our camp there. In fact, this is a dance. It is an ongoing process. We have to constantly integrate and reintegrate and manage these polarities when it comes, and these polarities can present themselves to us very differently depending on if we're looking at politics or if we're looking at, let's say our own integral practice, or if we're what have you, any issue, any topic, any sort of dimension of reality that we're engaging at any given moment, we're going to have a different sort of relationship between these two poles that we have to manage and keep an eye on and hopefully integrate in an ongoing way. And there's never an end state. There's never a point where like, oh, finally I've integrated. I'm done with that. It is a moment to moment, day to day, ongoing process. And I think framing it as a polarity is a nice reminder of that.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add to all that mix there. Thanks for whipping all those graphics up. And I liked your expanded version there. It helps paint that picture of like them being the spectrum here, and something that's ongoing. Also, if we take that through the developmental lens, that like, if we ask somebody to further describe, well, what does that look like? All these things, that answer could be very different. For example, like Amber level of what humility looks like, and something that somebody from a rational level where they're actually being humble doesn't sound humble to Amber level. Like, so to question the existence of God, like a sky God, kind of thing. Very different, right? But there is a genuine humility that exists at an Amber level of like, what does humility look like, But it's very different at a rational level. And even at a rational level, you can look and find arrogance at the rational level, even if that person is being humble. There's like this is built in, I think, into developmental levels of like each level adds something and points out something from the previous level. So that's one of the ways it progresses for me, and like, what is it like to go from like a more rational and self-authoring level to, self-transformative systemic way of looking at things, or an integral level, it's like, what these things mean is different too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I love the orange versus amber kind of, because that's
usually really obvious.
Yeah, it's a really obvious one. It's one of the major cultural fault lines that we have in the world right now.
Yeah.
And as integralists, I think we probably, if we can be so humble,
Yeah.
We probably feel like we've got a decent grasp on how we would like those conversations to go,
Well,
as opposed to how they typically go. And, I mean, one of the things that Amber and Orange, they're going to have very, very, again, different views. They're going to have
Yeah.
very different views that are animating their sense of certainty. Orange is going to have more certainty in like the scientific method, for example.
Yep. Mhm.
And Amber's going to have a lot more certainty in their views of God, right?
Yeah.
Now, there are underlying values that can connect these two different people. There can be a mutual appreciation of sacredness, for example. It's not like sacredness goes away at Orange. I mean, oftentimes it's kind of driven out because of
There's
various
usually
cultural
changes.
shadows, right? But there is a change, but there's an underlying universality to the sense and appreciation of sacredness that we can perceive in the world. Right.
Yep.
For Orange, maybe it becomes more of a sacred naturalism, right? It becomes more of a deist kind of rather than theism, right?
Yeah.
But there's an opportunity to connect like, oh man, we both see wonder and beauty and goodness and awe. And you know what I mean? There are common qualities. Now you describe it as sort of the features of your personal God. Okay, I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm certainly not going to disagree with that, because all that's going to do is close down the lines of communication between us. But let's apply those values outward. Let's see what happens if we can agree on the level of values, and then look outward to what's going on in the world and what's happening between us. And there's much more opportunity to build a bridge and to build a genuine relationship between the two, where both perspectives are actually sort of rewarding each other. They're informing each other. Like Amber has something Orange doesn't. Amber has something that actually gets lost as we transition to Orange, and Orange has something that hasn't yet emerged for Amber. I mean, there's an opportunity for a beautiful share there, which oftentimes, goes unnoticed and kind of falls away. But that requires, tremendous humility on behalf of both people in order to discover that sort of shared space between them in the first place.
Yeah. And it makes me think too that the experience of humility kind of arises naturally in developmental process, where even if, obviously like saying it like Amber and even the rational level, like the degree of awareness of development unfolding is not the same as it is later, but, their humility arises. It's just like, oh, I have to change, usually it's relationally motivated. A lot of times, like breakdowns in familial relationships say like, okay, I'd rather be in relationship with somebody I care about than hold on to my views, which then requires a little bit of flexibility, in how people think. And that's how you get like mytho-rational, the little combo action. It's like, all right, we can exist. These two levels can exist together. Yeah. Cool. Hope you're muted there, buddy.
Sorry about that. So yeah, I have just found all of this material, again, just so valuable, like immediately beneficial to me. I mean, I'm beginning to look at all the ways that, that sometimes I have a little bit too much humility, and then that can actually create sort of anxieties and fears and all of that. And, I've a lot of work I've been doing, just doing these shows with you guys over the last couple of years has been me sort of throwing myself into that and trying to, grow that sense of inner confidence. And, it's moved from like here to maybe here, and, eventually we'll get it like up to here, maybe. But this book, I think, has been very valuable for me. And I encourage other people to check it out. Again, it's called Think Again by Adam Grant. It was a New York Times bestseller. So whatever additional clout that that brings, there you go.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've been really enjoying it, and just again noticing how many things in my own life I've been sort of avoiding rethinking. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a lot of that stuff can come out of trauma. A lot of that stuff can come out of, well, when you're dealing with insecurity, in the first place, and you find something you actually like about yourself, it can be hard to bring the humility you need to those pieces of yourself, even, you know what I mean? It can be hard to rethink that, because it's like, no, this is the one thing I've got, and being able to hold that, I think, a little bit lightly can be challenging. And then there's people on the other side of the spectrum who, I think we see people all the time in the integral community and elsewhere who come from, sort of a place of sort of a poverty of confidence, which then turns into I guess sort of they oversteer for it, they overcorrect for it, and then that creates a sort of a brittleness in terms of how they hold their own intellect and their own sort of maps of reality.
Right. Yeah. That just goes back to talking about shadow work, where even though like integral community, obviously we like to talk about the maps, they're really useful and interesting. But then, shadow stuff is still there. And so a lot of times it's just like just working with some of that, and obviously there's just like shadow stuff exists, not just in isolated individuals, like it arose out of relational and societal, cultural context. And so, we're having to do all that work together.
Well, I would say, Ryan, if you even have the perception that you always have shadow somewhere in your system, if you can maintain that perception, then you've already got a head start on generating exactly this kind of humility, because only humility is that's the only way we can possibly tell ourselves, hey, I'm a little bit broken here, right? I've got some more work to do here. That requires genuine humility. That requires, and it requires, again, this developed intrapersonal line. I always enunciate that carefully so people don't think I'm saying interpersonal line, but the intrapersonal line, the ability to look within and to self-report and to, be honest about your own strengths and weaknesses and so forth. By cultivating that generates a field of humility that we can use to navigate some of our blind spots and biases and so forth. So even just having the perception that shadow exists for me means that I've already begun doing the work.
100%.
Bring myself into alignment with my humility.
Yeah, and the positive way of framing this as well is, and kind of using more language again from the realization process, but is like that there's always opportunities to reclaim more of our wholeness, to like more of our innate abilities. So that's like the exciting part, right? Because when we look at shadows, that like we talked about, it's like difficult, painful, heavy, it's like it doesn't sound so great up front compared to like growing up. Growing up sounds exciting, like more,
it's like the
better
sewers of the mind.
But the thing is like when we talk about knowing, it's like, well, you get to experience more fully your own inherent capacity to know. Won't that be great? So that's why to do this shadow work. Won't it be great to experience more of your own power, more of your own love, more of your own ability to express yourself, not about the content of your experience, but that innate ability. So like that can be a motivating way of framing it, saying like, oh, well, definitely want to do that. And Judith Blackstone, she says, realization is easy, but this work that we're doing it's a lifetime of like, and everybody has holding patterns and areas of themselves and their being where that's kind of closed off. So we're always working on it. But that's the upside, is like you get more of your own being by doing the shadow work.
That's right. Beautiful. Well, that was a good circuit. Do we have anything else we want to say about confidence, humility, whether physical, mental, spiritual?
I think it's covered a lot of ground here.
All right. Well, should we move on to a special part of the show?
Sure.
I hope we can have a little bit of fun here. Let's take this as an opportunity to practice our humility and to make fun of ourselves a little bit. So I created, actually many years ago, this was probably 7 or 8 years ago, I created this list of integral caricatures, which are really just sort of these broad stereotypes of qualities that I've seen, mostly in myself. Let me own that. Most of these that I'm going to share have been various shades of my own shadow. But also some things that I've perceived, in others in the community around me, the integral community around me. Well, I mean, let's be honest, it's probably all just me and none of these are shared by the community, but I'll let you guys be the judge of that. So again, I think the opportunity here is to have a little bit of fun, to self-reflect and to honestly gauge for ourselves whether or not we have been any of these caricatures and stereotypes at any point in our integral journey, or if we've really got this humility practice down, how many of these we might be right now at this very moment. So cool. Here we go. Top 10 integral stereotypes. Is that shared?
Yep.
All right. Number one, the Mick integralist. Notice my Microsoft Paint skills as I was creating the Ronald McDonald graphic.
Nicely
I think
done.
one of those books has a brief history of most things.
Well done, my friend. You put some effort into this.
So the Mick integralist. What do you get when you combine sophisticated post-metaphysical language with inexperience and fuzzy thinking? In the royal dining hall of integral consciousness, this is the fast food window. All the calories with none of that pesky nourishment. Mick integralists use integral theory in simplistic paint by numbers way, reducing the tremendous complexity and elegance of our world to glib generalizations and slogans. Spends all of his time labeling and categorizing reality without ever actually saying or doing anything meaningful at all. Mick integralists forget that orienting generalizations are little more than stereotypes. Incredibly useful and insightful stereotypes, but stereotypes nonetheless. McIntegralists are often quick to dismiss anyone or anything that does not cleanly fit into their facile maps of reality. A common phrase to know that you're dealing with a McIntegralist is something like, "You're so green."
Nice.
Number two, the integral know-it-all. The problem with learning a theory of everything is that it can fool you into thinking that you actually know everything, much to the chagrin of friends, family, and anyone unfortunate enough to be sitting next to you on an airplane. Know-it-alls use a scaffolded Cliff's Notes understanding of reality as a substitute for almost all genuine knowledge. This is often accompanied by an unsavory and unearned arrogance that will eventually get them beaten up by a graduate student. Common phrase. You hear this all the time, verbatim, Ryan. I've already reverse engineered everything I could possibly learn about psychology, business, politics, hermeneutics, ecology, and Eastern and Western philosophies from Ken Wilber's bibliography. What else is there to know? Again, if I had a nickel every time I've heard.
That's hilarious.
The Jargon Junkie. The Jargon Junkie tends to relate to their inner lives as one giant math equation. All they need are the right measuring units and conversion tables to figure out how to have normal conversations with people. They find themselves armed to the teeth with the latest and greatest jargon and psychobabble that money can buy, ironically sabotaging their own growth by overly defining themselves by whatever terminology they've picked up the most recently. Common phrase, again, if I had a nickel. Well, darling, I've recently learned that I am an Enneagram type 9. So if you want to continue our relationship, you will first need to study the worksheet I provided for you on this convenient handout. Knowing that you are a type 4, this may be difficult for you, so I'll be offering a breakout session in the dining room at 3:15.
Funny.
All right, next one, the state chaser. Once had a taste of the divine and now spends her entire life chasing the transcendent dragon. The state chaser takes spiritual bypassing to the big leagues, attracted like a moth to a flame, to any method of substitute gratification she can find, sex, drugs, or an endless gluttony at the mystical buffet line, lives almost entirely in the imaginal realm, spending countless hours counting angels and dancing on pinheads. Often suffers from spiritual diminishing returns due to ongoing neglect of overall psychological growth and balance, can easily turn into chronic solipsism when left untreated. Common phrase, well, from a non-dual perspective. The integral idealist. Fully understanding the integral map, the integral idealist remains trapped in an ivory tower of holistic idealism that prevents them from ever actually engaging with partiality. The integral idealist is unwilling to soil his hands by touching the world, at least until the world is ready to meet him on his own level. Common phrase, I won't buy integral products until they completely reinvent our economic system first. The provocateur disagrees with you just to disagree, even if you happen to be agreeing, and enjoys a self-image of being the elite among the elite. A high cognitive capacity, stilted language, and talent for perspectival gymnastics result in becoming perpetually trapped in a devil's advocate role. Having become so confident in his own understanding and embodiment of integral living, the provocateur no longer has much use use for people like Ken Wilber, whose work they have already outgrown and whose following is probably even holding them back. Provocateurs often feel a passionate disinterest in Ken Wilber's approach, and hence spend every waking moment letting the rest of the world know how utterly uninterested they are. Common phrase, why won't you debate me? No, when left untreated, the provocateur can quickly regress to the Dragon Slayer. Dragon Slayers are convinced that they have found the single thread that will unravel the entire integral sweater, some chink in the armor that will bring Ken Wilber's entire integral kingdom crashing down around him in one fell swoop. The Dragon Slayer sees himself as the protagonist in an epic struggle between good and evil, like the archer who sends an arrow through the dragon's single missing scale, killing the beast in one hyper-focused shot. Common phrase. Did you read my new article on Frank Visser's site?
You won't name any names though.
Frank, we're kidding, buddy. We love you, man. We love you. Just a joke. Again, humility.
You know some Dragon Slayers. I know that.
The Shadow Boxer. This one might be about me. I don't know. I can't tell. Enjoys making objects out of other people's subjects. Litters the community with passive-aggressive comments, often complaining about how everyone is being so passive-aggressive all the time. Spends time writing lists to make fun of other people's shadows. Common phrase, you should probably 3, 2, 1 that. This one has a treatment. That treatment is you should probably 3, 2, 1 that. And that brings us to number 9, the Spiral Wizard. This is my favorite graphic that I did. This is by far my favorite graphic I did for these. The Spiral Wizard uses integral language to mythologize and inflate their own ego. If you really go around calling yourself a spiral wizard, you're just asking to get punched in the face eventually. Common phrase, why do you keep punching me in the face? All right, stereotype number 10, the Super Pandit. This guy is just the worst. Thinks he's oh so cool because he invented integral theory and hangs out with celebrities. He looks like Clark Kent got stuck with Lex Luthor's barber. He's best known for drawing a plus sign on a legal pad and calling it quadrants. Now, again, I made these many, many years ago, so I had to do an update for this one. So we now have the updated Super Pandit. Same as the previous version, but less pre-trans confusion.
That's awesome. Gotta have the hair.
So there you go. The top 10 expanded to 11 stereotypes of the integral community. I want to know.
Yeah.
I want to know how it landed for you. I want to know if you know people like this. I want to know if you are one of these people. I have been at least 4 or 5 of them, sometimes at the same time, over my long 20-something year trajectory in integral world. So I'm hoping we can have a little bit of fun with that. I'm hoping it's a source of reflection. And again, it's just an opportunity for us to practice a little more humility.
I love them. I love all the images on there. You put a lot of effort into it. These are great.
I put a little elbow grease into this episode.
I feel like I just thought of one of like I don't know if you'd say integral doper, you know, like somebody like I was thinking integral Olympian, like trying to do everything, you know, like I want to become like a superhuman thing. That was like something I was trying to do, you know, with all my list. But I called like the integral doper, like, you know, like somebody just roided out, like
Yep, the integral ascender.
Do you even practice, bro?
Yeah. Do you even meditate, bro?
Yeah.
That's the other thing too, is that because I wrote these like 7 or 8 years ago, in the time since, I mean, there's been probably another dozen new caricatures that have come to the surface. I want to know what you think. Yeah, I want to know what you guys think those caricatures are. Let us know in the comments down there, wherever you find this, YouTube, Integral Life, what have you. What sort of common stereotypes have you seen? And again, the purpose here is not to be insulting or to be cruel, but to just
have fun. The humility of humor.
Yeah, exactly. It's to hold our shadows lightly, man, because Jesus, not a single one of us is walking around without a shadow. Sometimes your shadows are going to look like these guys. Maybe you've got your own odd concoctions that you'd like to share with the community. Let us know.
Gotta have some humor. That's a key sign with humility. I'm glad we land on this point. It's like, if never laughing at yourself. They
share the same root, right? Humor, humility.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right, man. Well, I'm feeling confident and humble.
Yeah, this is good. This is a fun one to do. I've been seeing people have been having a good time on chat. So thanks everybody for tuning in and
Nice. I don't have
joining
it.
us.
I don't have it open. Is there any questions over there that we?
No, I think that we addressed one of the main ones that people ask, and people are like actually having conversations amongst themselves as they
Oh, I love
listen.
it.
So that's perfect. That's really lovely.
Love it. All right, man. Well, this was fun.
Yeah, it was good to see you.
You too.
And everybody, you obviously see we're on a new time and day.
Yeah,
New
actually,
day, really, same time.
let's make that official. So we're doing now the
Yeah.
second Monday of the
Mhm.
month. It used to
Yeah.
be second Tuesday for the first like 2 years we did this. We
Yeah.
just made a change. It's now
Yep.
the second Monday of the month.
Yeah.
Same bat time, same bat channel.
Exactly. Cool.
All right, man. I love you,
All
buddy.
right. Love you too.
I'll talk to you soon.